because I am so excited to have you both on here to share what you know about podcasting awards. So, Michelle from the Ambies, I'm going to start it off with you.
Hi, I'm Michelle Cobb. I'm Executive Director of the Podcast Academy, which is a networking community for podcasters from all walks of life. So that can be you sell advertising or you are a host. And we do put on the Ambies every year. We're coming up on our fifth, whoa, because we
Nice.
started in 2020 and we did our first awards in 2021. And we will be having the show live in person on March 31st, 2025. Gulp, how did we get to 2025? In Chicago, the first night of Podcast Movement.
That's awesome. And yeah, no, it is really nice to start something in 2020 because then the math is just pretty easy, right? So,
Although you would think that, but like it's on some level, it's not. I think uh, it's almost like the first 2 years got lost,
that's
because
true. That is
I
true.
I felt like I'd met all these people and I really didn't meet them until 2022. But yeah, that's
Yeah,
another
well,
story.
as community manager, I feel like I have so many pen pals that I'm like, we've met in person, right? And they're like, no, we haven't. We've just been talking for so long. So yeah, Michelle, thank you so much for joining this panel. Really excited about this. And Naomi from the International Women's Podcast Awards. Feel free to introduce yourself.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you, Kendall. Hi, everybody. So, yeah, as Kendall said, my name is Naomi Miller, and I am the founder and director of Everybody Media, which runs the International Women's Podcast Awards. We also are rolling towards year five, so lots of similarities. We also kicked off in 2020 and had the first awards in 2021, so we're the same age as the Ambies. We did manage to hold an in-person awards in 2021 and have done so each year. So we were very lucky to meet a lot of people who were able to attend as the first thing they'd ever been to post-COVID. It was a crazy night. Everyone went nuts and it was really fun. But yeah, we've been kind of growing from there. So I, as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm based in the UK, which is where we run the International Women's Podcast Awards from. But we are all over the place and we are very fortunate to have contributors and entries from all over the globe, which is super exciting.
That's awesome. Thank you both so much for joining. And I see a lot of Davids in the chat over here. So welcome to like all five of the Davids in the chat. and, and one of the Davids has a podcast or finalist, two of their podcasts are finalists for the 2024 Independent Podcast Awards. So amazing. I want to start it off. I have a few of my own questions, but again, feel free to add them in the chat as we go. But I kind of want to start off with why podcast awards? Like, what's so important about podcast awards? Why should people apply? Because, I mean, I even see sometimes that there's a little bit of apprehension from some people, even around podcast awards. So I wanted to hear from both of you. Naomi, I'll start it off with you.
So I should probably open this segment by saying that I'm a total fraud on this front. In fact, I'm a total fraud in podcasting in general, because I'm actually a veterinarian by training and background, and that is my actual job, or was my actual job. So, but I had worked in women's networks in the veterinary field and in the wider kind of sporting field because I worked in the sport of horse racing for quite a long time and in the veterinary sector as well. So I was very used to supporting and mentoring women around in the business and in work. And I really enjoyed that, and particularly supporting young women as well. And when I got started in podcasting, I just kind of realized that there was a bit of a hole in that space all over the world, really. Elsie and Jess were doing, or have always been doing, fantastic work at She Podcasts in the US, but there
Hmm.
was nothing based in Europe at that time. And so I just decided to start a community for women in the UK in the podcast sector. And off the back of that, thought it might be fun to hold a podcast awards. I mean, I had no background in event management. I had very little idea, still do have very little idea what I'm doing. And I rolled the dice in the middle of the pandemic and think it struck a chord and people were very keen And I just really wanted to highlight and showcase the work that women were doing all over the world, really. And we always say that it's for anyone that identifies as a woman, both behind the mic and behind the scenes. Because one thing I really recognized was that there was very little recognition of people who were working as producers and editors and writers and all the other jobs that you never see, as well as being a host. So that was something that became really important to me as well.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I will say that it does seem like there's a little bit of a connect between horse racing and the horse race of podcast awards. So I'll drop that. But I'll also say that like it's funny to hear you say that you are like that you'd felt like a fraud because I think that that's something that I hear from a lot of podcasters as far as they're like, I just kind of started this because I was passionate about it and picked it up. So I just want to give you a little bit of credit that that's a background of a lot of different people, maybe not in veterinary studies, but in the idea that they kind of started in one thing and came to another. But what I mean by my question is really like how to like why should a podcaster care about winning a podcasting awards? Like would be a driver for them? Why is it important for their show? And Michelle, I'll pass it over to you.
Sure. So we started the Podcast Academy with the idea that we wanted an academy like the Music Academy or the Motion Picture Academy, where people from a particular industry, in this case podcasting, were recognizing each other's work and bringing it to consumers. So putting out there into the wider world all of these great podcasts being highlighted. So we really had the idea of trying to reach consumers to make sure that podcasting is on the same level with movies and television and music in terms of the entertainment world. So that's a very small task, you know.
Yeah.
You know, and we do, and our goals and our visions are quite lofty in that we don't want to just be people in one area. So right now, all of our awards are in English, with the exception this year of a new Spanish language award. But we have about 20% of our membership outside the US, and we're really trying to build a set of awards and a set of people across the globe who are doing podcasting in all different ways and who are really qualified to recognize the best of the best. And then we want to make a big splash in putting it out in the media, making sure it's on streaming so that people can see it, so that people are more aware of podcasting in general. So even if you're not, the winner, as a nominee, your podcast is getting press, is getting, recognized for how strong the work you're doing is. And so we put a high premium on making sure we have indie categories and categories that are genre based, are talent based, just trying to really make sure that we're reaching the widest variety of people without overdoing the awards. So we don't have hundreds of awards, we have 20 something. And it's a real push and pull. But if you as a podcaster submit and get a nomination, hopefully you are getting some play and some recognition from your peers, and it's getting into the consumer's ears in a new way.
I was also going to say we have some people in the chat that are saying why podcasting awards has been important for them. So David said, for someone running a podcast network, awards are a great way for our hosts to get some recognition for all of the effort that they put into their shows. It also motivates the hosts to want to win, which is really a great insight. I'll also say, that Crystal said it's a huge platform, which is humbling for someone to listen and acknowledge the efforts that go into it. So those are some really great insights too. I actually want to, we're going to move on to a question that Matt had asked. So I'll show that too. How are people's podcasts nominated for awards? So we talked about why awards would be something that you'd want to go after, but let's say that you say, okay, let's go into awards. how do you kind of get started? Even maybe before you start applying, how are you when you're recording episodes, doing your season, kind of keeping that in mind? And Naomi, I'll start off with you.
I think the first point of clarification is probably what people view as a nomination, because there are some awards where all podcasts are nominated and then you have shortlists and then you have winners. And I think just to that point, I'm assuming that nominations is what we would refer to as shortlists. And therefore, I guess it's a recognition that you have been have been picked from the crowd, as it were, I suppose, in amongst your peers.
I want to actually really quickly just interrupt you if that's all right to say. So I just want to pause on this point and ask, okay, so shortlist, like let's go through for somebody that's never been a part of this kind of podcasting world.
Sure.
What is the shortlist? What is the like? Let's go through those kind of terms and definitions.
I think that's really useful because it's all a bit of a muddle, to be honest.
Hmm.
For somebody coming in from the outside, I think it can look quite confusing. And I think also what I have taken away is that different awards use different terms, and
Yes.
that means different things to different people under different circumstances. And so I guess everything I say would probably be caveated by check the terms and conditions,
As most things are.
because it's probably different for whatever you're applying for, and I'm sure that we are different to Michelle. The way it works at the International Women's Podcast Awards, and I did notice that someone in the chat had asked about people identifying as women and non-binary. We are completely queer and trans inclusive as well, so anyone from the queer spectrum, including people that identify as non-binary, are super welcome. But I would say that the way we run it, and we may have to have a shake up for next year because the numbers of entries have become pretty huge. But we have a the initial entry process, and we guarantee that every single entry is listened to by the panel of judges. And later on, I might share about some of the criteria that we ask them to judge on. But
Yes, definitely.
they will then, that is then niched down into what we'd call a shortlist. And those lists are then released, and I guess that would be the equivalent of nominations potentially. And then on the night, we have a winner and a runner-up who are announced. So,
Okay, and
go on.
quickly before we go on, just Michelle, does that
Yeah.
differ for yours or?
A little bit in that, anyone can submit in the categories that they are eligible for. And, we do try to guide if a sports podcast ends up in true crime, we would help it get to the right place. So everyone who submits, all of those awards go into 2 rounds of what we call blue ribbon panel judging. So that is people who have filled out a form to tell us what their conflicts are, and we make sure they're not judging anything that they're in conflict with. And so we sort of have the first round of blue ribbon panelists who listen, rate all the podcasts on a number of different factors based on the category. It's slightly different for each category, and then whittle that down to a list of 15 titles in each category. And then a second round of blue ribbon panelists whittles it further down to 7 in each category, which we call the nominees. That would be equivalent to a short list, with the exception of Podcast of the Year, which has 10 nominees. And then on the night of, we announce just a single winner. So we don't do any, bronze, silver, gold, which you see in some podcasts, or a winner and a runner-up.
Okay, great. Okay, so then Naomi, back to you on this. We're getting a lot of questions in the chat about the submission process. So, how do you submit to these? And do you submit yourself? Do you have people nominate you? And then we'll kind of from there move on to how to best position yourself when you make that submission. But let's first start with how.
Sure. So, yes, you can submit yourself or you can submit for somebody else. So either is fine. And we do have some producers submitting on behalf of other people, and we have plenty of independent DIY podcasters who submit themselves. So we get loads of each, and both is absolutely fine. And the submissions process, so the way we stipulate for the IWPAs is that your submission is an up to 10-minute audio file, which can be edited and audio taken from several different elements, but it all has to come from one episode. So you can either have parts of an episode that have been cut together to create your 10-minute segment for your kind of best bits of that episode, or you can submit a continuous stretch of up to 10 minutes, depending on what you would like. And to make life easier on that submission, as well as the opportunity to submit an MP3 or a WAV file, whatever you like, we also offer the option to submit either an Apple or a Spotify link with a timestamp. So if you have a continuous segment of audio that you want the judges to listen to, you can say, okay, I want you to listen from 0 seconds to 9 minutes and 25 or whatever. And we implemented that a couple of years ago because we recognized that editing together audio when you've already edited a podcast episode and creating a new MP3 or WAV file solely for the purposes of a podcast awards submission is really time consuming, and people put a lot of time and energy into these submissions. And so that was one of the steps that we had some feedback that would make things easier and more efficient for people. So that is what we did.
That's really smart to put as few kind of obstacles between the work that they're like the being able to submit their podcast. So Michelle, I'll bounce that question on over to you on kind of how the how you submit your podcast.
Yes, we asked you to submit a complete episode. You can include some timestamps that you want the judges to pay particular attention to, but we're really looking for a full episode. If it's a fiction podcast that has a lot of plot in that first episode, even if it's not an episode within the last year, you may submit that first episode. But we're really encouraging people to think about what is their best episode. And we are going to be rating it on host, engagement, writing, depending on the category. But you really want to think about what's going to grab people and really make them want to listen. And, I always joke because I'm not a sports person. And so what I did one year, I'm not a judge, but I went through the process of like, what would it be like to do this process for a category that I'm not familiar with and I'm not that interested in, which was sports. And
I'm right there with you on sports. I'm sorry, guys.
Sorry, I know it's all tennis to me, and I don't even know tennis.
Oh, my wife plays tennis, so yeah, I'm really with you on this.
But what I found was I ended up listening to these podcasts that I never would have listened to because something was really engaging in an episode, and I went back and actually listened to full seasons of things because I was taken in. So even if it's an episode from the end of the season or, middle of the season, when the episode is engaging, that's going to be something that is encouraging people to do more listening. And so when you think about what to submit, think about what is the episode that's getting the most excitement and most positive feedback. That's something to really put forth. And we also ask you to put information in there, like if the category is about performer, who are the performers, to put artwork, all of that. So we have as much information there as possible, as well as links in case people want to judge outside of our platform and, on Apple or Spotify.
And I was going to ask, I mean, when you are saying, and like what, especially for Naomi, when you're saying just like 10 minutes of your podcast, what are you like, what makes the best 10 minutes? Is it that you want to listen to more? Is it that it creates this great snapshot of how your conversation flows? Like, should people be kind of submitting something that's a cliffhanger, or more of just like, hey, this is like a really fully kind of wrapped idea of what you get when you listen to this podcast, which of course makes people want to listen more. But I'm just kind of trying to get into what the definition of the best thing to submit would be.
So we've always been a little bit different and unusual, I guess, because unlike most other awards, we don't have genre-based podcasts particularly. Genre-based categories, I apologize. And so the categories for the IWPAs are things like moment of raw emotion, or moment of entrepreneurial inspiration, or moment of dramatic tension, or whatever it is. And so we we set those specifically at the beginning, and they do change, and they have changed over the years. And we also don't have very many categories. A bit like Michelle was saying at the top, we've only ever had 8 or 10, so it's not a big number. And within that, we have really honed down on those categories to give a range of options for people of different genres. And one that we introduced this year was something called Moment of Factual Clarity, because I had feedback from some people that ran science podcasts saying there's no place for us to go. And so I guess in terms of picking the audio that is going to be suitable, I think one of the things that is one of the commonest pieces of feedback from judges that we receive is, I'm not sure this is in the right category, or that people have read the description of what the category is all about. And that we do quite a lot, we put quite a lot of explainers out, or as much as we can, to make sure that people are clear what each category entails. And I think, and I don't know whether Michelle would echo this, but just reading the instructions carefully. I mean, it sounds so stupid, and it's like, read the IKEA manual. But yeah, it's like
IKEA manuals though can be hard.
yeah, I mean, ours are not just full of pictures, okay? But yeah, it's I think just having a bit of a think about what episode you have from your show that might best fit. And we have a category for moment of comedy gold, and what I always say to people is, you don't need to be a comedy podcast to have a super funny moment in your show. And if you have had a bit that you have really laughed at, or your guests laughed at, or we had the winner of the comedy gold category from last year, I think it was a show that was about high-end sex clubs in LA. It's kind of random. Like, it wasn't a comedy podcast by any stretch of the imagination. So I think just reading through the instructions and just giving it a bit of thought is probably a good idea, and working out what your best episode to lean on for that particular category would be my advice.
Amelia wrote in the
I
chat.
can see Amelia.
That was my
Amelia. Oh, you're hanging out here. Nice.
Amelia, feel free to drop the link to that in the chat, because I would love. I think that it's also great for people to be able to see what got a winning podcast.
Well, if you talk about podcasts that you then binged off the back of finding them out through a podcast awards, Amelia, nod to you. I did binge Sanctum Unmasked after hearing it through the awards.
That is awesome. And then I'll write Amelia's podcast, and I will hold on. I'm going to do something fancy over here that I love to do. And if people have watched these before, they will know what is happening, which is click over here right on the screen, and you can look up Amelia's podcast. Yay.
Also,
I, really
I
love
should
this
just
show.
say, she doesn't need loads of advice about how to win a podcast awards, because they submit from School of Humans, which is Amelia's podcast company. They submit super good entries. She should be the one giving this talk, not me. But anyway.
So feel free to. Oh, you're making her blush. So then you're saying that they submit really good entries. So besides just reading the instructions and making sure that you're writing to the right category, Michelle, is there any other top tips that you would give for people to kind of set them up for success when it comes to these awards?
Totally. So I'm going to encourage people to actually join the Podcast Academy. It's $100 a year with no discounts, and we have options for people from underserved populations to get a year free. Oh, look at that. And then actually become a blue ribbon panelist. The best way to really understand the process and to understand what other people in the market are doing is to become a judge and go through that blue ribbon process. Yes, it's not easy. You're going to be spending a lot of time listening around the holidays, but I think it really helps people understand who their competition is, what their competition is doing, and what other people in the market in general are just, trying and doing. So it forces you to listen to a lot of beautifully recorded and beautifully crafted podcasts, especially things that are not necessarily your bailiwick. And I think you learn a lot from that process. So I really do encourage people to join. Plus, you'll get a discount on all your submissions to the AMBIes anyway, and you'll get a discount on your next year of membership. So there's a lot of reasons for doing it, but first and foremost, I think it's a real learning process to hear what other people are doing and to force yourself to kind of like go through and judge other podcasts so that you start to realize, ooh, these are the things that, trigger me to say, I want to listen more. And that'll help you with your submissions in other years and to other podcast awards.
This brings up another question that Chris had asked in the chat. And then I want to go to you, Naomi, about your tips for kind of standing out against the competition. But does submitting come with a fee like film festivals tend to?
It does. I wish it could all be free, but we do give you an actual award if you win, which is very heavy and quite expensive. And we do, a big live show that we also stream. So none of those things are free. But I do recommend that if you qualify, you can get reimbursement through the Podcasting Seriously Fund. So that's a great way to support yourself as you're submitting to these awards.
Great. And Naomi, please to let us know if there's any top tips that you have for people that are looking to really set themselves up for success when it comes to these applications.
Yeah, I mean, I think listening to other shows, and I would echo what Michelle said about becoming a judge. If any of you who are listening to this either live or back would like to judge the International Women's Podcast Awards, you're very welcome. Guys as well, we are open to everyone. We do pay. It's only a small amount, but everybody gets a little stipend for judging for us as well. And yeah, we have plenty of information available if anyone is interested. So I'm sure Kendall will handle my details. But yeah, it's a really, really good way to hear what's out there. And we have a lot of people coming back year after year as a judge, which is really beautiful and gratifying. And people who say, I found it a really good way to discover new shows that I hadn't heard of. Is a common piece of feedback that we receive as well. I think it also allows you to, as Michelle said, really listen to the strengths and perhaps the less strong areas of other shows that are being submitted. We do have probably the kind of commonest area that is a bit of a stumbling block in the first instance is sound quality, and that has definitely improved through even people like me who mostly record at home having access to things like Riverside, Kendall. So it's
I was going to plug it, but I'm glad you
There
did.
you go.
It's a game changer. There's we are a long way from the days where like I started on Skype, yikes, back in the day, and that was so long ago, and it was really bad, and I didn't know how to use a microphone or anything, and so I think and there are also a lot of post-production and editing softwares and other ways that you can improve your sound quality in post if necessary. And I think just understanding the small things that really elevate a podcast from being quite a simple one-to-one interview or a one-to-two like we're doing now, for example, into just having that little bit of complexity, that little bit of edge, whether it's just a tiny addition of music here and there or just a very small amount of sound design here and there. And I'm not talking about a six-figure production. I'm talking about things that you can do at home as a DIY podcaster on your own using free available stuff online. And there's plenty of stuff out there which I won't go into now, but there's loads of good tutorials about just having those little things which can really, really take you to the next level.
Yeah, like so there's little things that you're saying can be a sound effect, it can be incorporating some music, it can be, are there any other things that you would say can really help step that up? Michelle, if you wanted to add any of those.
I mean, I think it's everything from good artwork on your podcast to having a good trailer. You know, we talked about trying to create a 10-minute block, but also trying to create a 1-minute trailer for your podcast. And it is things like going through some training around the interview process. So, how you ask guest questions and then incorporating those uh, bits into what you're doing, how you're dealing with the guests, how you're asking the questions, what outside research you're bringing in to the podcast itself, all of that. And one of the things we do at the Podcast Academy is we have lots of webinars that are included with your membership, and we also have mentorship. And that can be a really good way to focus in on, hey, I want to learn a little bit more about post production, or I want to learn a little bit more about marketing, or I want to learn a little bit more about how to create some element of a podcast, like, it could be interviewing, because I'm stuck on interviewing today since we're doing an interview.
Yeah,
So
it's
those are all
Riverside.
things, yeah, exactly. All things that you can, bring into your thinking as you create your podcast, because it's everything from, a successful podcast is everything from the audio to the metadata itself and how you're writing that and how you're getting visibility. So it's all of those things that you're thinking about holistically as you're trying to grow your podcast, which we are all trying to do.
And I have a question from Chris, but actually reminds me of one of the questions that I had written down, which is when I had, I'm just going to be completely upfront, which is that when I had posted about the podcasting awards, I didn't expect it, but I got a lot of people that were writing back that seemed a little bit disenfranchised, that they're like, the people that are winning these awards have producers, they have editors, like, there's so, like, I think that there's a little bit of worry among individual, like indie podcasters, that they're like, how do we stack up against Wondery, you know? And
Yeah.
so, yeah, so I wanted to talk about, like, have both of you guys kind of touch on that,
Mm.
on how does an indie podcaster kind of go up against those kinds of giants? And yeah,
Well,
um, yeah, Michelle, you go first.
so we have categories specifically for indie podcasters, both the indie podcast and indie host. We have a do-it-yourself podcast award as well. And the fact of the matter is, because we are, like Naomi's organization, relatively new, and the people who are judging are thinking about the podcast, quality itself. We are getting, these are professionals in podcasting, whether you're doing it yourself or you're with Wondery. People are creating such amazing work that we're actually getting a lot of things that are fantastic, even if they are from somebody who's completely independent and literally like doing it in their basement. We've been amazed by how well those things hold up. And, you're not going to win every time, but even getting that nomination is really, really super helpful. But we do try to balance it. We have lots of independent podcasters as members, and we have lots of independent submissions. And you can see from our nominations that we are getting a lot of independent podcasters making it to the top, which is a testament to the work that everyone is doing.
Yeah, Naomi, do you want to answer that as well?
So yeah, this was something that I have been very conscious about, and so for this year's awards on the application form, we actually introduced two questions because we don't have different categories for either independent or podcasts that come from a network or commissioner. So instead, every entry had two questions which were just multiple choice, and it said, how many people are involved in the making of your show from the start to finish, including everything from idea development, story development, guest booking, interviews, host, all the way through to marketing at the other end. And it was just a tick box to say 1 to 3 to 5, 6 to 9, or 10 plus. So we just had so the judging panel then had an idea about how many people were involved in the making of that show. And the second question was, is the show self-funded by the creators, or financially supported by an independent entity, which did not include advertising or sponsorship revenue. And so again, we didn't ask any questions about how much people were making or anything like that. Just, do you guys fund it yourselves, or is it commissioned by an external entity? And that just gave the judges, for every entry that they looked at, an idea about how many people were involved and what the kind of financial status of the show was. And in the UK, obviously a lot of things are commissioned by the BBC. So some shows will carry the BBC stamp, even though they are actually made by very small teams of very small production companies or independent producers. And I guess that's a bit of a it's a bit of a quirk to the UK, although, you know, people are producing for the BBC worldwide, but that is definitely something that we see over here, probably more than would be seen in North America, for example. So that is a way that we have tried to kind of provide some context for the judging panel and gain a bit more of an insight into who we're hearing from and the kinds of shows that are being shortlisted after that. And we were, I think the number off the top of my head was 69% of the shows that were shortlisted this year were made by teams of 4 or less people from start to finish.
Oh, that's great.
So, I mean, there's a lot of great stuff out there that are not being made by huge teams, and undoubtedly some stuff was coming from big companies, yes, and some of the one or two of the winners had really big teams behind them, but one or two of the winners also had one person. And one of our winners this year created from LA with her 6-year-old son. That was it, literally on her own from start to finish. And so
That's amazing.
I think it's
She hasn't come up in the chat yet. But we'll see. Okay, great. I had a few questions in the chat. One of them is from Flo. What if your show is monthly? Does release frequency matter? Naomi, I'll start with you.
No. The only stipulations written into the terms and conditions is that you have to have released a minimum of 5 episodes. So we are not on awards for single episode documentaries, for example. This has been a question that has been asked a lot, so it's something that I'm considering for next year. But yeah, so you have to release a minimum of 5 episodes, and the episode from which you are entering your audio has to be released within the 12 months prior to the awards taking place, because we are an annual event.
Michelle, do you have any feedback on that?
So you have to have 3 episodes released in 2024. And it doesn't matter when they were released. So as long as we know it's an ongoing show in some way. As we get into the end of the year, so this is where it gets a little complicated as you're thinking about submitting. If you're starting your podcast, say in November of that year, are you going to have 3 episodes coming in? And as long as we have 3 episodes coming in by December 31st, that's what we're looking for. And the submission closes November 22nd, but you can still submit an episode after that if it's coming out later, or you can pre-give us your episode before it's available on the distributors.
And we're getting a lot of questions on how to submit. So I'm just going to show these on the screen again. If you are watching along, you can, if you're watching in Riverside, you can click on this link to submit to the AMVs. I'll bring that up again throughout this stream. If you're watching the recording, you can also find this link in the notes. And then for the International Women's Podcast Awards, I'll put this on the screen as well. And this link also includes signing up for their newsletter. So if you want to learn more information about the International Women's Podcast Awards, get updates and news, that's also the place that you can go for that.
We're not open for submissions at the moment. I'm really sorry, everybody. We will
I was like, I don't have
the AMVs is open for submissions. We are not right now. We're taking place in June 2025, so submissions will be opening early spring 2025.
Great. So sign up for that newsletter and you will get those updates. And I just want to go through a few other questions. Trista had one that said, how does one make their podcast established enough? And that she's scared to apply for fear of kind of the rejection. Is there kind of some advice that any of you would have to somebody who might be a little bit fearful to apply? Uh, Michelle, you go.
Well,
You go first.
I think we all so much of the time, especially for many women, have imposter syndrome, right? And sometimes you just got to push through that fear. You're not going to be judged in the way that if you don't get a nomination, you don't get a nomination. That's it. No one's coming after you and saying, here are 50 things that are wrong with your podcast. They're listening to it, they're putting in their scores, and they're moving on. So it's really between you got the nomination or you didn't. So I wouldn't be afraid. It doesn't hurt you to apply. And the fact of the matter is, if you don't apply, you'll never get it. So push through the fear. I've been discussing that a lot with a friend of mine who is unfortunately coming to the end of their life, and how important it is to just put yourself out there and try, because the regrets we have in life are often when we don't, and why we don't do something is often linked to fear.
Absolutely. Naomi, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think Michelle has just summed that up beautifully, to be honest. I guess you never know if you don't try, do you? And if you believe in your show, which I'm sure everybody watching and listening to this does, because otherwise you wouldn't still be subjecting yourself to making a podcast on a weekly or monthly or whatever basis. You have to believe in it. And we all love what we do, and hopefully other people will too. So yeah, just go for it. Like Michelle said, nobody's going to come back at you and say this is everything that's wrong with it. Of course they're not.
And I will say, for independent podcasters out there, like, after each year, I get calls from big companies saying, hey, why didn't this show get, nominated? It's done really well. It's like, well, the judges didn't rate it as highly as the other shows. Did you listen to the other shows that were nominees? Yeah, they were really good. It's like, okay, so don't take it personally, but just know that even at the biggest, highest levels of the industry, people still have imposter syndrome, and they're like, why wasn't it me? So they're afraid too.
Yeah, and I would just back that up by saying, actually, if you are towards the beginning of your podcasting journey, or even if you're not, I think you don't necessarily know what doors are going to open after some form of recognition. And those of you who have had anything to do with us may have heard this story before, but one of our first winners at the first International Women's Podcast Awards was a newbie independent podcaster who started her own show at home during the pandemic. She now teaches podcasting at Stanford, and she had no background in audio. She taught herself everything to begin with, and yeah, it's doable. It's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy, but good things happen sometimes to good people. So give it a whirl.
Yeah, I was also, speaking of kind of these independent creators, Flo had a great question. What do you qualify as an indie podcast? For example, I produce a show for a startup, but I produce it myself with one editor. We're a team of two. So we have guaranteed funding, but are not part of a larger podcast network. Would that, what would qualify to both of you as kind of being an indie podcast? Michelle, you can jump into that one first.
Yeah, and in our definition, an indie podcast is intended for individuals or micro production teams, so that's fewer than 5. You have to have the title self-financed, not supported by, say, the BBC. And then we also have the do-it-yourself category, and that is for podcasts with a budget of $500 or less per month. And we actually ask you to submit a budget so we can make sure that you're in the correct place. So an indie podcaster host is that micro team, less than 5, and do-it-yourself has a protracted budget, and in both cases they have to be self-financed.
Okay, and Naomi, is that kind of matches with what you guys are calling it, but or not?
We don't differentiate between independent or otherwise, because I have always found it very confusing, and I'm a very stupid person, so I was keeping it simple for myself rather than for anyone else.
Well, judging by this conversation, you are definitely far from a stupid person. Your insights have been really valuable and helpful, so thank you for that. And Maria, says, artwork has such an impact on whether or not someone clicks on your podcast. Any advice on how to stand out visually or practical tips on collaborating with artists and designers? And I know that isn't specific for podcasting awards, but we did talk about the importance of that artwork. So, is there anything that you guys look out for when you're looking for that podcast artwork? Naomi, you can go first.
Yeah, well, I would actually give a nod to two women that I heard speaking on this topic, amongst others, last week at the International Women's Podcast Festival, which, if you haven't heard of it, is also worth checking out. Content is Queen is the name of the organization that runs that. And these were two very successful podcasters, and they were speaking, in amongst other things, about podcast artwork and basically about it being bold and simple. And I think a lot of us have podcast artwork that is a bit busy. And one thing that Raj mentioned in particular was that you forget that I forget, I think other people do too, that when you view your podcast artwork as a tiny icon on a phone screen, it's really small. And my own podcast artwork has been quite busy over the years, and the font was loopy and beautiful, but not that easy to read, for example. And I think for me, I'm somebody who's quite aesthetically drawn to things that look nice, but are maybe not like, whoa, in your face. And actually, my kind of personal takeaway has been less is more. Get your title really easy to read and don't have too much other stuff going on. Like, I've seen podcast artwork with taglines written, but the writing is so tiny that you can't read it, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Michelle, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I totally agree. Like, we are looking at these things on tiny, tiny screens. The other thing I would say is now you have the option to do episode artwork, and that can be an opportunity. So if you're an interview podcast, have a picture of your guest. Not only will that put some differentiation in your feed, but it can also be a way for that guest to be interested in promoting the episode with that special artwork. And it's a good size that you can also use that artwork on social. So it's a way to kind of repurpose the content that you're making.
And we're reaching the top of the hour, but I wanted to just ask both of you if there's one takeaway for somebody who wants to get involved in podcast awards, what would you say is the one thing that they should kind of take away from either from you or from this webinar? Naomi, I'll ask you to go first.
I think potentially viewing podcast awards as an opportunity to look beyond the actual gaining of an award is something that we have focused on as well, because as Michelle said at the top of the hour, the potential growth opportunities and other advantages that can come from being nominated or potentially winning are great. But also, one thing we've been super focused on at the IWPAs is the opportunity for people to meet other podcasters and really connect and work in a lot of cases with other people that they have connected with through that platform. So we spend a lot of time introducing people and asking, like, who do you want to meet and what are you interested in? And if they're coming to the event in London, great. And if they're live streaming, great. Like, we will do our best to help you in any way that we can. And I think just being very clear about the kind of community. I know it's a very overused word these days, even though it sits in your job title, Kendall.
I was going to say, you're talking to a community manager here.
I know. But I think, like, the kind of collaborations that can occur alongside the recognition that you might achieve, but also understanding who else is doing it well in your space that you might not have heard of is a great opportunity for people.
That's great. Michelle, yeah.
And all I can really do is echo that, because yes, it is that community, and it is the learning process of going through, especially if you judge, and learning what other people are doing, and then having an opportunity to, meet them, whether it be in person at the awards or, on a networking event that TPA is doing online. Uh, It is that connection. Here we are in the world. So much of what we're doing now is virtual, and any point of connection, especially with other people who are making the same type of art that you are, is an opportunity. So use it as an opportunity to network, to learn, and really to push yourself.
I think that's a really, really great takeaway from both of you. And also, just want to drop that if you are looking to learn more about podcasting and about kind of what you can do on Riverside to also set yourself up for success on these webinar for these for your podcast awards and everything you can do with the editor. We also offer a live demo every month. If you're watching later, I'll put the link in the show notes for you. But we go through all of the different ways that you can do some of the things like you were talking about, adding some, like a little bit of extra flair to your videos, or really just being able to take full advantage of the tools that you have. And I also just wanted to make sure, I'm just going to pull up this on my screen for a second. So I mentioned that we have the live demo, but we were talking about kind of learning and connecting with different community members. We've just released the new community hub over at Riverside, and it has guides from creators from all over the world on different skills. So it could be a checklist on what to post on social media, or tips on how to get the best audio out of your podcast. So I am going to add that because I'm very excited to kind of show that off to the community here. So, oh, that's join the community. I meant to put up the Riverside Community Hub. So that has checklists for everything that you'd need. Maybe after this, actually, we'll work with one of you to create a checklist to set yourself up for success for podcast awards. Or if any of you that are watching want to submit a checklist on anything that you feel like you have expertise in, let's talk about it. So you can apply in there to contribute. Also, we have 2 community groups. One's on Discord and one's on Facebook. And they are a really great opportunity to connect with other creators. We have more than 18,000 people in those communities right now that can really support you, help you out, answer your questions. And I think that that's kind of what these communities are really all about. And my email is also on here, kendall@riverside.fm. So if you have any follow-up questions or need anything, my inbox is always open, and I'm always happy to help you all. One more time, I'm just going to put up the links to submit to the Ambies if you would like to. I would also add some info on the International Women's Podcast Awards. And last but not least, I really want to thank everyone in the chat for joining along live, and especially to the 2 of you for joining me and offering these really incredible insights. I feel really inspired by them, and I hope that you all that are watching along feel that way too.
Thank you, Kendall.
Thank
Of
you.
course.
It's great to be here. And it was nice to meet you, Naomi.
And you?
We love these connections. That's what this is all about. So thank you all again. And if you do submit to these awards or submit to any other awards, please let me know. I would love to keep updated about what you guys are all doing. And especially if you win and you get that heavy award that Michelle mentioned, I'll let you know you can break it off into pieces like in Mean Girls and throw it around to all of us, right? So cool. All right. Well, thank you all again, and have a great rest of your day. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.